we are currently in a series that we started a couple of weeks ago called Deliver Us from Nowhere. And what we're doing with this series, we kind of crowdsourced our topics for this series several months ago. And basically we sent out text messages and emails to everybody and just asked like, hey, what are some things that you've felt confused by? Or maybe you grew up in a church environment and you were kind of handed this series of ideas, propositions, beliefs, and as you got older, you began to sort of question, like, wait, why do I think that? And why is it that we talk about this in this way? And here are some confusing ideas that sort of I've always carried with me, and I'm not totally sure why. And so we kind of crowdsourced that and just began asking, what would you like to hear us talk about? Either to kind of give a little bit more color or expression to an idea that you've held for a long time, or to maybe help unpack, like, why is it that this thing just doesn't work? The thing that I've always been told. And so we've been doing that for the past, 2 or 3 weeks since we started the series. And y'all gave us some really interesting, responses. And we said at the very beginning of this, like, there's no way everybody's going to be able, or we're going to be able to cover every single question that people ask, because there were over 80. And we only have 8 or 9 weeks to do this whole series. So we had to consolidate as best we could. So today we're going to be responding to a couple of, there was a kind of prompt that showed up over and over again. One is, it says, why do bad things happen? Is God in control of them? This always comes up. Anytime you do sort of hey, let's do some Q&A on theology and biblical topics, this always becomes a thing that people want to talk about. Why do bad things happen? And if bad things happen, is it because God caused those bad things to happen? And then a second question that came out of those surveys that's very similar is, if God is sovereign, or in other words, if God is all-powerful, why is there evil in the world? These are great questions, and these are questions that people have been asking for thousands of years. And we had more sort of in line with this. These are the two most directly asked ones that we could just quote, and without offering more context. But we had several questions that came up that basically kind of were leaning towards the same thing, which is, if God is good, why is there evil? If the God of the Bible is compassionate and good and loving, then why do we suffer? And so, and again, this always comes up. This topic always comes up anytime there's any kind of open forum about the Bible or God or theology. It's usually broken into 2 categories, and we lump them together a lot of the time. But it comes into there's suffering and then there's evil, and so we tend to lump those 2 things together and say, well, we're going to talk about evil and suffering. But these are really, they're related because one can cause the other, but it's almost 2 different questions. And so suffering, you could argue, could be anything that we go through that isn't necessarily caused by the choices made by another person. So an accident could cause suffering, or a natural disaster, or a disease. These are things that aren't necessarily, didn't necessarily come from somebody making a malicious choice, but it did result in someone suffering. You know what I mean? And so there is the question of, why is there suffering? Why do bad things happen? And so we're going to spend most of our time talking about the second half of the question, which is the question of evil. I'm going to do a quick 60-second sermon on suffering, if I may. So, I do not believe, so the question becomes, is God in control? Does God cause suffering? If God is all powerful, does God cause suffering? Personally, I don't believe, in my theology does not lend itself to believe that we were created or serve a God that causes or gains any kind of enjoyment from human suffering. I don't believe that that's the case. There certainly are pockets of, I say pockets, there are massive chunks of people and beliefs and denominations that will argue that yes, all things are caused by God, even suffering, and suffering somehow brings God glory. I think that is absurd. I will, I would be happy to recommend some books and have longer conversations with you about that. There is a stream of thought that's basically all things are predestined, therefore all suffering was predestined and caused by God. Again, I don't agree with that. I don't think that that's a healthy way of looking at or talking about the God of the Bible. But if I'm wrong, I was predestined to be wrong. And so that's what I tell my Calvinist friends, and they hate it when I say that. So anyway, we could and certainly will have longer sermons and series that cover those questions in the future. But what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of spend some time talking about the question of evil. Because the thing about evil is it usually happens in some sort of interactive situation, right? Like usually evil is done like one person makes a choice and another person basically suffers the consequences of that choice, therefore evil. And so that's going to sort of be where we spend our time today. So if you were wishing you were at the lake for Labor Day weekend, you will be a lot more in about 20 minutes or so. So the question is, why does evil exist, and how are we supposed to deal with it? What is the cause of evil? Does God cause evil, or is there some sort of otherworldly malicious force that causes evil, or is evil like a creation of human beings? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So very light. We're going to keep it very light for this holiday weekend. And I'm going to go ahead and warn you right now, it's going to get weird. We had a lot of ground to cover. I had to email the staff earlier this week, like, look, I need as much time as possible, and I promise you it's going to get weird. So we'll see. Again, in about 30 minutes, you're going to see if I'm right about that. So which leads us to the question, have you ever been in a casual conversation with somebody who had certain religious tendencies, and that person at one point or another, or maybe you're the one who posed the question, just kind of casually brought into the conversation, so who do you think the Antichrist is? I've had that question asked to me in like random non-church related settings. I think somebody once asked me that question at like a fair, like with corn dogs and stuff. And so like, just like, hey, we're standing here, we're just kind of making chit chat. Any thoughts on who the Antichrist is? Because when you're a pastor, those kinds of questions come up sometimes. So, and you may be sitting here being like, what are you talking about? So, like I saw The Omen, but I can't really remember what the whole idea was. So the idea, when we talk about this idea, when somebody brings this into the conversation for whatever reason, what they're asking is, what they're basically suggesting, there is someone out there somewhere who is not just evil, who will not just make evil choices, but this person is so evil that they will eventually set in motion a series of events that will lead to the end of all things. And actually, we did get a couple questions about that. So we're almost kind of like we're going through the side door to answer somebody else's question there too. This idea, by the way, of the Antichrist being like a central like historical figure, it did not amazingly originate with like airport novels that you can buy on layovers. It originated in the late 2nd century. It was the first person to sort of suggest this was a 2nd century writer by the name of Irenaeus of Lyons. If you're interested in a little bit of light reading, you can go check that out. But in that span of time, like since from then to now, lots and lots of names have come up. And if you Google who is the Antichrist, which I do not recommend, and I did it so you wouldn't have to, but you will get any number of people on the suspect list. I'm going to name some for you. Over the past like several hundred years, who has been suspected of being the Antichrist? I told you it was going to get weird. So one of the earlier ones was the Roman Emperor Nero, which, yeah, I mean, we can all see it, right? So then the Pope, and when you're asking like which Pope, all of them, all of the popes beginning in the 16th century have been accused by somebody of being the Antichrist. Hitler, I feel like that's a gimme though, right? Like that's like the free space in bingo. Like obviously somebody's going to guess Hitler. Henry Kissinger has been named. Mikhail Gorbachev, I actually remember this one. Remember, because he had a birthmark on his head, and so there was this whole thing like, oh, the mark of the beast. So, poor guy. So, Napoleon. Oh, every American president. No, literally, every American president has been accused of being the Antichrist. Not just every American president. Most of the people who have ever run for president have been accused of this. Just to be safe. Then it gets very strange. Danny DeVito has been named. I don't know. I thought he was beloved. So I think it has to do with like the arrangement of like the number of letters in his like first, middle, and last name. I don't really know. Spanish King Juan Carlos I, for any number of reasons, but mainly because he owned a boat called the Dragon, and so they were like, "That's it. That's the giveaway." Bill Gates, Prince William. There's a supercomputer in Brussels called the Beast. That's definitely been on the suspect list. The internet, which that's kind of broad, is it not? Like, I mean, there's at least one or two like articles. I wouldn't call them like mainstream articles, but like people who have suggested like maybe the entire World Wide Web is like one giant Antichrist. So then we get into fictional characters like Superman, Barney the dinosaur, which some of the parents are like, yeah, I see it. So then Mr. Rogers, like how in the world does Mr. Rogers end up on your list? Like if your whole vibe is like love your neighbor and be helpful to your parents, you're like, what's this guy's deal? So just to name a few, and you could go further and further down the rabbit hole. But anyway, all this to say, there has for a long, long time, there has often become this conversation about like somewhere out there is an evil figure, and if we can just figure out who it is with our red string and our index cards and corkboard, we can figure it out, and then we can do something about it. I don't know. Maybe we'll have solved the puzzle, or I don't know. So there is this notion of if we can just figure out who is the most evil, then we can just sort of do something about that. And so there's always been this impulse for hundreds of years or thousands of years, really, to assume that the worst forms of evil exist somewhere else, out there somewhere, and that we just need to spot it and stand in opposition to it, and then we will be on the correct side of whatever cosmic battle we happen to be fighting. And so the question of why is there evil is a very old question, because asking this question is actually asking that question. Anytime we're having conversations about who is this mysterious figure, what we're asking is well, where does evil come from? And where do we, when we're looking for, if we're following the thread of where evil comes from, how far do we have to go? And so so today we're going to talk about evil. We're going to talk about spiritual warfare, and we're going to talk about Antichrist. So, which leads us, of course, to the book of Revelation. It had to. So we're going to look at the book of Revelation, chapter 12. So in the book of Revelation, and we've talked about this before, you've got this guy named John. John is exiled on an island called Patmos, which is near Greece. And John is writing a letter to 7 different churches in what was then known as Asia Minor. It's modern day Turkey. And so he's writing to 7 different churches in 7 different cities. And he's addressing there's lots and lots of suffering going on in this territory in Asia Minor. And so what John is trying to do is he's trying to kind of give language to why is it that we're suffering so much? Why, he's in exile. The people he's writing to are going through daily situations where they could be arrested, they could be killed, they could starve to death. There's lots of horrible, terrible suffering going on with the people that John is writing to. And so John is writing to this from Patmos, and he's writing to these 7 churches, and they've experienced lots of pain and suffering and evil. And so John is attempting to give some sort of language to all of the suffering that people have experienced, and he's reaching for ways to give some sort of larger meaning to all of it. And not just have it be sometimes we suffer. And it becomes, John begins to sort of give very grand images. And he's trying to give big poetic language to real life hardship, because sometimes we need a historian to explain things to us, but sometimes we need a poet. And John is engaging it from a poetry level. And what I mean by that is John is drawing pictures, and he's using images that are not meant to be taken literally. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to grab for and reach for other ideas and images that the people in this context would have already recognized. And he's trying to reappropriate those things to say, we have been asking these questions for a very long time. This is not a new thing. And so that's why John uses so to us, thousands of years later, reading somebody else's mail, this seems strange and bizarre and cryptic. But to the John's readers, they would have been like, oh, I see. And so we're gonna take a look at one of those situations. So in Revelation 12, we'll just start in verse 1. It says this. And again, remember, he's writing to people who understand what he's saying, who are in these 7 cities. It says, a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. So already it's weird. And so John begins with, there's a woman, and there are certain things that we already know about her. She's clothed with the sun, whatever that means, and the moon is present, and also there are 12 stars. Now, the number 12, anytime in Revelation you see the number 12, it is meant to always represent the people of God, because John is writing to people who come out of a Hebrew tradition. And in Hebrew tradition, the number 12 represents the 12 tribes of what became known as the nation of Israel. So anytime John uses the number 12, what he's saying is we're talking about the people who make up the group of people who refer to themselves as followers of Jesus or the people of God. And so that is a thing that he's referencing here. And also when he says there's the sun and the moon are also present, these are ways of saying, oh, we're also talking about all of creation. At the center of this whole thing is there are the people who follow Jesus. But also if you zoom out a bit, then you begin to see the whole thing, it's actually about everything. What it is that we're talking about here has to do with all creation. And so essentially he's saying what we're about to talk about is going on. What we are about to talk about is what's going on with the people who are following Jesus currently, but it also has to do with all of reality. It's much, much bigger than just us. So then in verse 2, he says, she, the woman, was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Are we taking notes? Then in verse 4, it says, its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. Sure. So the woman is pregnant, and now there's a dragon, and the dragon wants to eat the woman's baby. So that's the image that John has painted for us. We all caught up now? So then in verse 9 it says, the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. So now we've identified the name of the dragon. The dragon has been named. It's been named Satan. We'll get back to that in a minute. So, and then in verse 13 it says, when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. So there's lots going on here, and if you're thinking like, how are we going to get out of this one, guys? It's like, yeah, this is a giant like tangled up hairball of ideas and images, and like, how in the world are we going to untangle all of this in the amount of time that we currently have? We're going to try, but I am going to have to talk fast. So there's a lot going on here. So here are the big ideas. This is not an unfamiliar image. Believe it or not, to the people who are receiving this letter, they actually would have recognized this image. This is not like, he's not like saying something and they're like, what in the world, what drugs is this guy taking? Like, they would understand this image. They would have known it. Because at this time and in this place, one of the most widely revered gods in the ancient world was a god named Apollo. So this is a photo, or not an actual photo. No one had a camera or anything like that, but this is an artist rendering of the god Apollo. So the Greek god Apollo was one of the major points of worship for the god Apollo was in a city called Thyatira, which is one of the 7 cities that John is writing to. So the people who are receiving this in the ancient, I was going to say ancient Turkey, but Asia Minor, in this part of the world, everybody knows Apollo. Apollo is a well-known god in the Greek pantheon. So one of the 7 cities that John is writing to in the book of Revelation is actually the center of worship for Apollo. So I'm sure if you're familiar with the story of Apollo's birth, which why wouldn't you be? But so the story of Apollo's birth goes a little something like this. So Apollo's mother was a goddess named Leto. Leto had been impregnated by the god Zeus, which we've all heard of Zeus. Zeus is the most powerful of the Greek gods. By the way, Zeus's temple, we saw a couple months ago, the main temple to Zeus is in a city called Pergamum, also one of the cities that John is writing to. So Zeus has impregnated Leto with Apollo. So the problem, though, is Zeus does not want Leto to have this baby because he's already married to the goddess Hera, who, by the way, Hera is crazy jealous about Zeus's chronic infidelity. She is not a fan of it. So Zeus, depending on which tradition, either Zeus or Hera sends a red dragon to hunt down Leto and wait until she gives birth so that the dragon can eat the baby. So, and the dragon, by the way, in the story of Apollo, the dragon's name is Python. And so Python is sent to chase Leto all over the world until she gives birth. And at that point, Python has been instructed to eat the baby. So in the ancient mythology of this time, there is already a story about a woman about to give birth to the son of the most powerful god. And a red dragon has been sent to kill and eat the baby. So already, like, again, if you are living in Thyatira and you get this story, you're like, oh, right, yeah, this is a story I've heard 100 times. So Python, by the way, is unsuccessful. And Apollo is born, and 4 days later, Apollo has become a full-grown man because Greek gods, they just grow up so fast. And so 4 days later, Apollo has become a full-grown man, and so he hunts down and kills Python as an act of vengeance for his mother. And so this is an ancient artist rendering of Apollo striking down Python. So all this to say, everyone in John's original audience would have known this story, not unlike how we retell the story of the Nativity every Christmas, right? Like, if you start making references to like the 3 wise men and the baby born in a manger or something like that, automatically you're gonna be like, yeah, I've heard that story a million times, right? That's how this story existed in ancient Turkey. So John is writing a version of this story, but he's changing some of the details. So again, you would have known the story really well. There would have been ritual retellings of the story. There would have been probably public reenactments of this story. And so if you lived in a place where Apollo was worshipped, which everyone receiving John's letter did, this is one of the major stories you just would have known. It would have been just sort of in the consciousness of everyone living there. So John is writing to this group of people, and he begins to retell the story that they all would have known. And in fact, right up until he names the dragon, because John calls the dragon Satan, right? But in the Apollo story, the dragon is called Python. So up until he renames the dragon, everyone would have assumed he was straight up telling the Apollo story. Nothing has changed up until he renames the dragon. So, oh, by the way, just as an aside, if you're looking for more connectivity there, one of the things that Apollo is the god of is the sun. And in Revelation 12 in verse 1, what's the first thing we learn about the woman? She is clothed with the sun. So already he's reappropriating the Apollo story, like right from the jump out of the story. So when John renames one of the characters, he's also trying to change what the story is about. He's reappropriating the story to make a new point about something else. So John is trying to make a point about the nature of good and evil, which is, again, I realize we've taken the long way around here, but John is trying to make a point about what is the nature of good and evil, and what does it mean for us to begin asking questions about this. So what does John do? He doesn't say, well, here, let me give you a bulleted list of like theological propositions about why evil is what it is. No, he takes a story that everybody would know and he retells it. This is a very narrative-based, story-based culture. The idea of like a list of bullet points to make your point, like that wasn't really something you would see a lot in this time. People make their points by telling stories. And so John takes a story that everybody knows and he retells it as a way of saying, like, let's try and get to the root of why it is that we see so much evil and suffering all around us. And he says, he's saying, like, look, we have always had a sense that there was this grand struggle between what is good and what is evil. It's been showing up in our stories and myths since the very beginning, like all the way back as far as we can look. We have stories about this conflict between what is good and what is evil. And it goes all the way back to before the birth of Apollo. So then in verse 17, he writes this. He says, then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. So John is saying the struggle between good and evil was never actually just about Apollo. It's always been about Jesus, which means it's also about the people who are following the way of Jesus. John wants his readers to see that there is this ongoing struggle between what is good and what is evil. And he uses a very familiar story to make his point. And he's using something very familiar to introduce something new. So what is the nature of the conflict? If you kind of dig into sort of like what exactly is John trying to say? He's not talking about a literal woman and a literal dragon. He's taking a story that they know and he's saying, let's try and use this language to kind of get to the root of why it is that we feel like we're suffering in the ways that we are. So what is the nature of the conflict? These people that John is writing to have experienced violence. Some of them have experienced devastating natural disasters. In one of the cities, there was a massive earthquake that destroyed a massive chunk of the city and killed lots of people, not long before John wrote the letter. Many people have been forced into poverty by their circumstances. There's a lot of starvation. There's a lot of suffering. People are afraid of being arrested just for being a part of this thing that seems to be denying that Caesar is Lord. And so there's a lot of tension sort of just hanging in the air for these people. And John is basically saying, like, let's kind of get to the root of this. Let's take an old story and see if we can find something new inside of it. Which brings us, so if we were there, if we were receiving this letter and it was going to sort of like ring true to any of us, we'd have to ask questions like, well, have I ever been in a situation where I had to ask myself, why does this have to be so hard? Or have you ever been in a situation and thought, like, why does everybody else seem to be able to get through things without this level of struggle or difficulty? Maybe you were trying to do the right thing and things got difficult and other people began to abandon the path of doing the right thing. And then you found yourself a lot more alone than you ever expected. And you had to sort of make some choices about what does it look like for me to continue doing what I believe is right, even though I'm kind of alone here. Have you ever been in a situation like that where you were sort of faced with a moral dilemma of, well, if I do the thing that I believe is the right thing, then I'm kind of on my own. So John now is writing to people who are trying their best to stay true to their path and to be a force for good in the world. But it's way more difficult than they ever expected it to be. They're finding that it's lonely and it's hard. And people are dying. People are being arrested. People are starving to death. And it doesn't have to be this hard. It shouldn't have to be this hard. And so the question they have to be asking themselves is it really worth it to keep going? Is it worth it to keep pushing forward when everyone else seems to have given up? When it feels like doing the right thing seems kind of like a fool's errand? And so John is saying this conflict that you're feeling, this tension that you're feeling, it's a lot older than any of us. And any time we try to bring any amount of good into the world, there will always be some amount of struggle. There will always be some other force or forces that want to push back against that because it doesn't suit their interests, or it may seem like it threatens the power structure that got them here in the first place. Are you with me? So it's possible that anytime we say to ourselves, we're going to try and do something good, we're going to try and bring some amount of grace or peace or life or hope into the situation, and you find that it's a little bit more difficult than you thought. Why is that? Well, maybe the system that got us here does not naturally make way for the new, good, beautiful thing that you're trying to bring into the world. And so anytime someone attempts to bring justice into the world, there will always be someone who is threatened by that. Because there are questions of power that begin to be asked when we have those kind of conversations. Or anytime someone tries to introduce love or kindness into the world, there will always be someone who offers hate or apathy instead. There certainly are people and groups of people who have a lot to gain from people being at odds with each other. There are entire news networks devoted to this idea. And so these people, thousands of years ago, are suffering and struggling. And people are asking, why? Why does it have to be this way? Why is there evil? Why is there suffering? Which again, thousands of years later, people were asking the question. And as you can see, today, we're still asking this question. And John is telling this story. And he's saying, as a way of saying, you know why. You know why it's hard, because it's always been this way. It has always been hard. It has always been a struggle to bring good into the world. There will always be opposition coming from somewhere. There will always be someone who stands to gain from not making progress. There will always be someone who feels threatened by equality. There will always be someone who, or a group of someone's, who would prefer things remain the way that they are instead of making more space for grace and peace and hope and love. Which brings us back to the question of, who's the Antichrist? Naturally. So first of all, a little bit of debunking, if we may. The word Antichrist never actually shows up at all in the book of Revelation. This may shock some people. Like, not once does the word Antichrist ever appear in the book of Revelation. It actually only shows up 4 times in the entire Bible, and all of them in small letters written by an early group of, written to an early group of Christians by a guy named John, who was, it's unlikely he's the same John that wrote Revelation. You might be shocked to learn there are more than one. There's more than one person named John in the ancient world. It was and remains a very common name, and so anyway, so you have this guy named John, different John, writing to a group of early church believers, followers, and not in the book of Revelation, but in these very short letters, enters this word 4 different times. So this other John is writing to a group of Christians, and he's attempting to address the same basically the same types of questions that we've just been talking about. Why is this so difficult? Why is doing the right thing? Why is participating in a story that's about good and healing and redemption? Why is it so difficult sometimes? Why are we suffering? Why is there so much evil all around us? Very old questions. So in 1 John chapter 2, this is what John writes. He says, "Dear children, this is the last hour. And as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour." And by the way, if you take this to mean like the world's about to end, this letter is 2,000 years old. I don't know that it was actually that kind of last hour. So this is how we know it's the last hour. They went out from us, but they did not really belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But their going show that none of them belong to us. So I don't know if like that's a tangled up like web of words, I realize. So first of all, a couple of things. First of all, whatever he's describing, clearly he believes either it is currently happening or it has already happened. So when he talks about this, it's not about like somewhere way out in the future. Are you with me? He's not saying like thousands of years from now, someone will become like the Pope or elected like a world leader, and that person will be that. No, he talks about, he says, many antichrists have come. So he's talking about it either in present or past tense. So he's saying there were recently, and he begins to elaborate. If you follow it along with his like word salad here, he begins to elaborate, and he begins to say, there were recently a few people who were actually a part of this movement who, for whatever reason, it's unclear to us now, they decided they didn't want to be a part of this movement anymore. They decided this was not for them. And not only did they leave, now they are actively trying to harm and destroy what we have built here. And he begins to describe this group of people as antichrists. So he's basically saying, like, yeah, there were people who were with us, and now they're actually actively working against us. They're working against what we're trying to do here. And so then if you jump to chapter 2, verse 22, he writes this. He says, "Who is the liar? It is whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a person is the Antichrist, denying the Father and the Son." Okay, so again, when we talk about Antichrist, as it appears in the Bible, we are not talking about some sort of shadowy future figure who will set in motion like global catastrophe. That never is a thing that shows up. Again, not until Irenaeus in the late 2nd century does anybody suggest that that's what's going on here. So in the Bible, Antichrist is used to describe a category of behavior in which a person or a group of people works in opposition to the work of Christ in the world. It is quite literal. It is a person, there is the work of Christ, and then there is the work of Christ. So the story of the dragon versus the woman takes us back to this. Something good is attempting to enter the world, while something else is attempting to prevent that good from entering the world. And John is using the word Antichrist in very broad, again, very literal terms. Anytime the work of Jesus is disrupted in the world, that is, by definition, anti-Christ. Are you with me? So if Christ is attempting to challenge people to love and welcome the stranger in our midst, any attempt to do violence against that stranger would be, by definition, anti-Christ. Or if Christ is attempting to challenge people to love our enemies and refuse to dehumanize people that we struggle to love, any attempt to stoke grievances or draw lines in the sand between like them and us, any attempt to do that kind of thing, by definition, would be anti-Christ. So if Christ is attempting to challenge people to care more for the most vulnerable people in our midst, any attempt to make life more difficult for that group of people would be, by definition, anti-Christ. So anytime you hear something that seems cruel or evil, and you wonder, how is this happening? How is it possible that that whatever this is allowed at all, and people are actually willing to look the other way and just to be fine with this? Because this seems horrific. This seems cruel. Anytime you ask questions like that, what you're doing is you're joining a story that's very old. You are echoing a cry that is thousands and thousands of years old, because these are the same questions that the people in ancient Turkey were asking thousands of years ago when John was writing this letter. So our questions about evil and suffering are not new at all. They're maybe the oldest questions we have, which of course leads us to questions about another term that perhaps you've heard, given your like upbringing or tradition, which is the term spiritual warfare. So again, we have assumptions about what we're talking about when we talk about. And by the way, if I am completely like pulling on a thread and it's causing like maybe some panic or some outrage, like that's fine. I get it. We were expecting that. It's a holiday weekend. We didn't really think anybody was going to be here anyway. So let's talk about spiritual warfare, shall we? Since we're here. So again, not sure how familiar you are with this term, but it's often used to basically describe something that sounds a lot like Ghostbusters, except demons. You know what I mean? So like there are like these invisible like monsters that are attempting to like wage war against your soul, and your job is to like swat them away or whatever. And so conversations often about spiritual warfare often begin with the assumption that, again, there's some sort of big invisible evil out there somewhere. Like, I am good and pure, but out there is some sort of evil that cannot be contained, and my job is to like resist this external force of evil, and we tend to call that spiritual warfare. So what if the concept of spiritual warfare, in a more biblical sense, is what happens when something good or life-giving is attempting to enter the world, and some other force attempts to prevent it? So let's look at a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. So in the book of Romans, you have this guy named Paul, and he's writing to an early church. And in verse 9, Paul writes this. He says, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another, honor one another above yourselves. Then jump to 14. It says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Then in verse 17, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. And then verse 19, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. In other words, like this guy's going to be so confused by you showing kindness after he's done so much harm to you. Then in verse 21, it says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. What is spiritual warfare when Paul talks about it? For Paul, spiritual warfare is what happens when we are conflicted over how we treat other people. So Paul writes things like, prioritize the needs of others above yourself. Or if someone does something harmful to you, don't fire back at them with more evil. Don't bring more evil into the world. Don't become the evil that has been done to you. Try and bring some amount of good into the equation. So what if spiritual warfare doesn't have anything to do with like invisible demons with horns and pitchforks? What if spiritual warfare, as it is discussed in the Bible, is when we wrestle with the inner conflicts over whether or not we treat other people with kindness and dignity? What if any time we have a moral dilemma and we have to ask questions about how should I talk about or treat this person or this group of people? What if that is what Paul's actually talking about when we talk about spiritual warfare? What if spiritual warfare is what happens when we wrestle internally about whether or not to treat people we don't like or that we don't understand? And we have to sort of reckon with every person I'm talking about was created and is loved by God. Therefore, maybe I should begin talking about them in those terms as well. There's a writer named Richard Beck who I love. He wrote an incredible book about this topic, which I highly recommend. It's called Reviving Old Scratch. And Old Scratch is it's sort of an old-timey way to talk about like evil and the devil and those kinds of things. And so he writes a book called Reviving Old Scratch, and he begins to sort of reframe it in exactly these terms. And Dr. Beck says this. He says, spiritual warfare is the tactical interruption of the world with love. In other words, anytime we enter a situation that has the potential for darkness or violence or hate, and we interrupt that situation with love or compassion or the rehumanization of the other, grace, peace, hope, maybe that is engaging in spiritual warfare. Maybe anytime we enter a situation and it just feels like there's a heaviness, there's a darkness, and we attempt to bring some kind of light into the room, maybe I would argue this is what Dr. Beck is saying, is that is what it looks like to engage spiritual warfare. What does it look like to interrupt violence and hate with love and forgiveness? That's what we're talking about. So part of this work in wrestling with questions about evil and suffering and spiritual warfare is the hardest part, which is recognizing that, yeah, sometimes this is in me too. Again, the thing about like a lot of this discussion about like antichrist or spiritual warfare, what it does is it almost sort of like gets us out of the way. It kind of lets us off the hook a little bit, and it puts everything out there somewhere. And so what if we reframe it in these terms, what it does is it says, like, what if it begins on the inside? What if this conversation, what if this struggle begins by us asking questions about, like, is there any of this in me? It involves looking in the mirror and recognizing all the ways that I might be partly responsible for participating in the darkness or the pain or the violence that people are experiencing. So the question really becomes, do I want to face the darkness inside myself? Am I prepared to confront the possibility that there's a little bit of that in me? The thing that I'm always lamenting that there's, I can't believe it's so bad. Is it possible that I've contributed? Is it possible that I'm a part of the story in a way that I wish I wasn't? So two things are true about each of us. And this can get really frustrating because it kind of creates a point of tension. Two things are true. One is you are loved exactly as you are. There's nothing you have to do to be loved more by God. And two, you are capable. You and I are both capable of evil and destruction. Both things are true. And we all live in the tension between these two truths. So sometimes I'm the woman trying to give birth. Sometimes I'm the dragon. And so the question becomes, what does it look like for me to participate in bringing more good into the world? Sometimes I'm trying to bring more goodness and life into the world. Sometimes I'm the one, I hate to admit it, sometimes I'm the one helping to prevent goodness and life from coming into the world for whatever reason. Another quote from Richard Beck's book, he writes this. He says, spiritual warfare is filled with small daily acts of resistance to live humanly in an inhuman world. So when we ask questions about evil and pain and suffering, and we shake our heads about how terrible things can be and why does it have to be this way? I can't believe it's gotten to be this bad. We also have to begin asking questions, is there any of that in me? Have I helped create more of that? Am I bringing life into the world, or am I the dragon trying to stop that from coming into the world? Sometimes I'm the woman, but sometimes I'm the dragon. So what does it look like, as in the words of Paul, what does it look like for me to overcome evil with good? What does it look like for me to participate? And I realize like we're using a lot of like big, like woo-woo kinds of terms. I'm sure there's a better word for it than that, but like mystical, I'll say like types of terms that that I'm sure we have a lot of baggage surrounding. And I'm not trying to like unthread all the things you think about like everything, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to reframe how we talk about these things in the way that the Bible talks about these things. And a lot of times we try and ascribe all the worst things to something that's going on somewhere else or outside of us. And what I think Paul is inviting us to do is say, like, maybe we start by looking internally and begin asking questions about, are there ways that I'm actually pushing back against good entering the world? Like, yeah, these are old questions, and they will continue to be old questions. We are not going to solve the question of like evil and suffering on a Sunday right before Labor Day. Like it's just not going to happen. But what we can do is we can acknowledge, like, yeah, this has always been in the narrative. Like we have always been asking these questions. We've always been curious, and we've always kind of wondered, why is it that things are so hard? And it's because, like, yeah, that's how it's always been. We've always asked these questions. And so the real question becomes, what does it look like for me to participate in bringing more good and life and healing into the world? Sometimes I'm the dragon, but sometimes on my best days, I'm the woman. And so may we choose to bring more life and good into the world. May we recognize that our internal struggles to bring those kinds of things into the world, that's spiritual warfare. How do we resist anti-Christ? Well, we work for what Christ is working for. We push back on things like hate and violence. We push back on things like resisting the call to be compassionate towards the stranger and the refugee and the people that we don't understand. What does it look like for me to bring good into the world? It looks like overcoming evil with good. It looks like me bringing something good into the world, participating in a story that is about the reclamation of hope and grace and peace and life. So may you resist the urge to be the dragon, and may you instead choose to be the woman giving birth to something good in the world. We're going to take communion now. And communion is this beautiful reminder that Jesus gives us. Jesus says, do this. When you remember me, do this. Because what communion is, it's not Jesus like clenching his fist and asserting his authority. He's saying, what if the best example that I can give you about what it looks like to bring goodness into the world is me breaking myself open and pouring myself out? Maybe there's a cost to bringing something good into the world. Maybe we are invited to break ourselves open and pour ourselves out in all sorts of ways in order to bring goodness into the world. So Jesus gathers his followers and he says, when you think of me, when you remember me, this is the image I want in your head. The breaking open of the self, the pouring out of the self for the goodness of the world around us. Sometimes spiritual warfare looks a lot more like breaking ourselves open and pouring ourselves out, choosing to bring something good and beautiful into the world. So as the ushers continue, if you already have one of our communion, I should also say, if you don't want to take communion with us, please don't feel like you have to. If you would like to, everyone is welcome to. Everyone is welcome at this table. So if you want to take communion with us, I want to invite you to peel off that top layer. There's a wafer on the inside. This is meant to represent the body of Jesus broken for you. And Jesus says, take and eat and do this to remember me. And then if you'll peel back that second layer, there's a little bit of grape juice. This is meant to represent the blood of Jesus poured out. And Jesus says, take and drink, all of you. Do this to remember me. So take and drink. And as we take and eat, and as we take and drink, as we participate in this ancient picture, may we be reminded that the whole thing is about pushing back against the darkness and the evil, that our invitation is to bring more good and light and hope and grace and peace into the world. May we be the woman and not the dragon.